Right now, across California's Central Valley, something unprecedented is happening. Farmers are walking away from 500,000 acres of prime agricultural land. Not selling it, not leasing it, abandoning it. These aren't marginal farms struggling to make ends meet. These are some of the most productive agricultural operations in the world, responsible for feeding much of America. But they can't get water. The State Water Project, which normally delivers 4 million acre-feet annually to Central Valley farms, is operating at just 5% of normal allocation this year. That means farmers who built their operations around reliable water delivery are now facing a choice: watch their crops die slowly, or cut their losses and walk away. Many are choosing to walk away, permanently. Entire almond orchards that took a decade to mature are being bulldozed because there's no water to keep them alive. Pistachio groves worth millions are being abandoned to die in the California sun. This isn't a temporary drought response. This is the systematic destruction of American agriculture. And if you think this only affects California, wait until you see what happens to food prices when 40% of the nation's produce supply disappears overnight. California's water crisis has reached a breaking point, where farmers across the Central Valley are permanently abandoning over 500,000 acres of agricultural land, threatening nationwide food security as the state that produces 40% of America's fruits, vegetables, and nuts faces systematic agricultural collapse. Here's what's happening right now across California's agricultural heartland. The State Water Project, a massive infrastructure system that moves water from Northern California to farms throughout the state, has reduced allocation to agricultural users by 95% compared to normal years. This isn't a temporary shortage during a dry season. This is a permanent restructuring of California's water priorities that treats farming as the lowest priority use. Central Valley farmers who have operated for generations under long-term water contracts are receiving delivery notifications of 0 acre-feet for the entire growing season. 0. Farms that historically received 1,000 acre-feet of water annually to irrigate crops are getting nothing. Operations that planned crop rotations, made capital investments, and hired seasonal workers based on contracted water deliveries are being told those contracts are meaningless. The math is brutal for agricultural operations. An acre-foot of water, roughly 326,000 gallons, costs farmers about $200 when delivered through state water projects. On the open market, that same acre-foot now costs $2,000 to $3,000, if it's available at all. For a typical 500-acre farm growing almonds, the water cost alone has increased from $100,000 per year to over $1.5 million. Most farming operations cannot absorb a 1,500% increase in their primary input cost and remain viable. Permanent tree crops face the most devastating impact. Almond trees take 7 to 10 years to reach full production and can produce nuts for 25 years or more. These represent massive capital investments that farmers finance over decades. But almond trees need consistent water year-round. Without irrigation, they die within months. Once dead, the entire investment is lost forever. Farmers are making the heartbreaking decision to bulldoze healthy, productive orchards rather than watch them die slowly. Pistachio operations face similar destruction. California produces 99% of America's pistachios and 40% of the world's supply from farms concentrated in the Central Valley. These farms depend entirely on irrigated water because the region receives virtually no rainfall during the growing season. Without state water deliveries, pistachio groves that took a decade to establish are being abandoned. The global pistachio market is watching California's water crisis with growing alarm as major production areas go offline permanently. Annual crop farmers have different but equally severe challenges. Vegetables, melons, and field crops can be replanted each season, but they require water during critical growing periods. Farmers are being forced to leave fields fallow, not because they lack seeds, equipment, or labor, but because they have no water for irrigation. Land that produced millions of dollars worth of food annually is now sitting empty, generating no income while farmers still owe payments on land purchases, equipment loans, and infrastructure investments. The human cost behind these statistics is staggering. Third and fourth generation family farms that survived the Great Depression, droughts, market crashes, and regulatory changes are being destroyed by water allocation policies. These aren't corporate agribusiness operations with diverse revenue streams. These are family businesses where multiple generations invested their life savings, borrowed against future production, and built their entire livelihood around farming specific parcels of land. Small farming towns throughout the Central Valley are experiencing economic collapse as the agricultural base disappears. When farms shut down, equipment dealers close. When farmers stop buying supplies, local businesses lose customers. When agricultural workers lose jobs, schools lose enrollment, and communities lose population. The ripple effects of farm abandonment destroy entire rural economies that have no alternative economic base. Water allocation decisions favoring urban and environmental uses over agriculture represent a fundamental shift in California's priorities that most residents don't fully understand. The same amount of water used to keep one almond tree alive for a year could fill a residential swimming pool. But that almond tree produces food that feeds people nationwide, while the swimming pool serves recreational purposes for one household. California's water policies increasingly prioritize urban amenities over food production. This crisis stems from multiple converging factors that have been building for over a decade. First, environmental water allocations now consume the majority of California's developed water supply. The state dedicates massive volumes to maintaining water levels in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta for fish habitat protection. These environmental flows take priority over agricultural deliveries, even during severe shortage years. Delta smelt, salmon, and other fish species receive guaranteed water allocations, while farmers get nothing. Second, urban population growth has increased municipal water demand substantially, while new water infrastructure development has been blocked by environmental regulations. Cities receive priority water allocations over agricultural users during shortage periods. As California's urban population grew by millions over the past 2 decades, agricultural water was reallocated to serve residential and commercial development. Third, groundwater pumping regulations have eliminated the backup water source that historically sustained farms during surface water shortages. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act restricts agricultural pumping from underground aquifers, removing the safety net that allowed farms to survive previous drought periods. Farmers can no longer pump their own groundwater to replace missing surface water deliveries. Fourth, water infrastructure maintenance and expansion has been systematically underfunded, while agricultural water has been diverted to other uses. Aging canals, pumps, and storage facilities operate at reduced efficiency. New storage projects that could capture more water during wet years have been delayed or canceled due to environmental opposition and regulatory hurdles. The water delivery system is literally falling apart, while demand from all sectors continues growing. Fifth, interstate water rights battles have reduced California's total available supply as other western states assert claims to Colorado River water. Arizona, Nevada, and other states are demanding larger shares of finite water resources, leaving California with less overall water to allocate among competing uses. Climate change and multi-year drought patterns have reduced overall supply just as demand pressures increase. The regulatory framework treats water as a public resource that should serve environmental and urban needs before agricultural production. This philosophical shift prioritizes abstract environmental goals over concrete food production, despite the obvious reality that people need to eat regardless of fish habitat conditions. The unintended consequence is the destruction of the agricultural sector that feeds the nation. Federal environmental regulations compound state-level problems by requiring specific water flows for endangered species protection, regardless of agricultural needs. The Endangered Species Act gives fish habitat absolute priority over human food production, creating a regulatory framework that treats farming as environmentally harmful rather than essential for human survival. 3 scenarios could unfold over the next 5 years, and all of them involve significant changes to American food production and pricing. The worst-case scenario involves continued water allocation reductions that force the abandonment of over 1 million acres of California farmland. Permanent tree crops would be systematically destroyed as irrigation becomes economically impossible. The state that currently produces 80% of the world's almonds, 99% of America's pistachios, and massive quantities of fruits and vegetables would cease large-scale agricultural production. Food prices would spike 50 to 100% for affected crops as production shifts to other regions or countries with less efficient growing conditions and higher labor costs. Rural California communities would become economic wastelands as the agricultural base disappears completely. The base case scenario features selective water allocation that allows some agricultural areas to continue operating while others are abandoned permanently. Large corporate farms with political connections and financial resources would secure limited water supplies, while small family operations would be forced out of business. California's agricultural production would drop by 40% to 50%, with significant impacts on food availability and pricing nationwide. Agricultural employment would fall dramatically, creating unemployment and social problems throughout the Central Valley. The best-case scenario requires immediate policy changes to restore agricultural water allocations and fund new water infrastructure development. Emergency water transfers, groundwater pumping allowances, and fast-track approval of new storage projects could prevent total agricultural collapse. Even under this optimistic scenario, California would lose at least 200,000 acres of farmland permanently, and food prices would increase 20 to 30% as remaining farms pass higher water costs on to consumers. Food price increases will affect every American household, regardless of which scenario occurs. California produces 40% of the nation's fruits, vegetables, and nuts. When California production drops, the remaining supply must come from other regions with different growing seasons, climate challenges, and cost structures. Mexican and South American imports will increase substantially, but international suppliers cannot immediately replace California's massive production volumes. Specific crops face dramatic price impacts. Almond prices have already increased 60% over the past 2 years as orchards are abandoned. Pistachio prices are following similar patterns. Fresh produce items like lettuce, broccoli, strawberries, and citrus fruits will see significant price increases as California production areas shut down. Processed food companies will face higher ingredient costs that get passed directly to consumers through grocery store pricing. The economic consequences extend far beyond higher food costs. Agricultural equipment manufacturers will lose customers as farms shut down. Transportation companies will have less cargo to move. Food processing facilities will close or relocate as their agricultural supply base disappears. The entire agricultural value chain that supports millions of jobs nationwide will contract as California farming operations cease operations. Regional economic impacts will be severe. The Central Valley, which depends almost entirely on agriculture, faces unemployment rates that could exceed 30% in farming communities. Local businesses, schools, and government services will lose their tax base as agricultural property values collapse. Rural hospitals and healthcare systems, already struggling with limited resources, will face additional pressure as their patient base shrinks and insurance coverage declines. Export markets will be disrupted as California loses its position as a major agricultural supplier to international customers. The state currently exports billions of dollars worth of agricultural products annually, generating foreign exchange earnings and supporting American trade balances. When California farms shut down, other countries will fill that export demand, reducing American agricultural competitiveness permanently. If you live anywhere in America, California's agricultural collapse will affect your household budget and food choices directly. Here's what you can do to prepare for higher food costs and potential shortages. Start adjusting your grocery budget for significant food price increases. Plan for 30% to 50% higher costs for fresh produce, nuts, and processed foods containing California-grown ingredients. Track current prices for items you buy regularly so you can identify increases as they occur. Consider shifting toward less expensive protein sources and basic staples that aren't dependent on California production. Learn to identify California-grown produce in grocery stores and develop alternative preferences. Most packaged produce includes origin information that shows whether items come from California farms. Familiarize yourself with seasonal growing patterns in other states so you can time purchases when non-California alternatives are available at lower prices. Explore local and regional food sources that don't depend on California agriculture. Farmers markets, community-supported agriculture programs, and local food cooperatives often source from nearby farms that won't be affected by California's water crisis. These alternatives may cost more initially, but could become competitive as California prices increase. Consider growing some of your own food if you have space and time for gardening. Even small-scale growing can reduce grocery costs for high-value items like fresh herbs, salad greens, and specialty vegetables. Home food production provides security against supply disruptions and price volatility in commercial markets. Stock up gradually on non-perishable items that contain California-grown ingredients before prices increase further. Canned goods, nuts, dried fruits, and processed foods often include California agricultural products. Buy extra when these items go on sale, but avoid panic buying that creates artificial shortages. Monitor agricultural commodity prices and news from California farming regions. Understanding the trends in almond, pistachio, citrus, and produce markets can help you anticipate price changes and adjust buying patterns accordingly. Several agricultural news websites track California farm conditions and water allocation decisions. Support policy changes that prioritize food production in water allocation decisions. Contact representatives about the need to balance environmental concerns with agricultural productivity. Vote for candidates who understand that America needs domestic food production capability, regardless of other policy priorities. Consider investing in agricultural land or food production companies outside California if you have investment capital. The destruction of California agriculture will create opportunities for farming operations in other regions that can increase production to fill market gaps. Agricultural real estate in water-rich areas may appreciate significantly as production shifts away from California. Plan for potential food shortages during the transition period as production moves to other regions. Keep emergency food supplies that don't require fresh produce. Learn to preserve and process foods when they're abundant and affordable. Develop cooking skills that work with whatever ingredients are available, rather than depending on specific items that may become expensive or scarce. Don't assume that government intervention will solve this crisis quickly. Water allocation involves complex legal, environmental, and political issues that take years to resolve through policy changes. Prepare for California's agricultural decline to continue for at least 5 years, regardless of political promises to address the problem. Here's what we know for certain. California farmers, are abandoning over 500,000 acres of productive agricultural land because state water allocations have been reduced to 5% of normal levels. Permanent tree crops, representing decades of investment, are being bulldozed because farmers cannot afford water costs that have increased 1,500% over normal levels. The state that produces 40% of America's fruits, vegetables, and nuts is systematically destroying its agricultural capacity through water policies that prioritize environmental and urban uses over food production. The human cost includes the destruction of multi-generational family farms and rural communities that depend entirely on agriculture for their economic survival. The financial cost includes billions of dollars in lost agricultural capital and infrastructure that cannot be easily replaced when water becomes available again. The national cost includes higher food prices, increased dependence on imports, and the loss of America's most productive agricultural region. Water allocation decisions made in California's state capital are destroying food production capacity that took over a century to develop. The infrastructure, expertise, and agricultural systems being abandoned represent irreplaceable national assets for food security. Once orchards are bulldozed and farms are abandoned, restoring that production capacity would take decades and require massive reinvestment, even if water became available again. California's water crisis exposes the fundamental conflict between environmental ideology and human needs for food production. State policies that prioritize fish habitat over agricultural productivity ignore the basic reality that people must eat, regardless of abstract environmental goals. The unintended consequences of these policies include the destruction of the very agricultural systems that could support sustainable food production for future generations. This crisis will reshape American food systems permanently as production shifts to other regions and countries with different environmental conditions and cost structures. California's unique climate, soil, and growing seasons cannot be replicated elsewhere, meaning that lost production capacity may never be fully replaced by alternative sources. What do you think happens when America loses 40% of its produce supply? Will policymakers finally recognize that food production requires water? Or will environmental priorities continue destroying the agricultural systems that feed the nation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for updates as this agricultural crisis continues unfolding. The destruction of American farming is happening right now, one abandoned acre at a time, and the consequences will reach every kitchen in America.